Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I just want to send love to each and every one of you, and I hope you're doing so well. So don't forget to get that lovely cup of coffee or that cocoa, unless of course you're doing something else. But I can't wait for you to join me now because I've got a very exciting story that you're just going to love. It would seem that we have a Bigfoot that is rather in love in this story, so let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Steve and I've been a private investigator for over 20 years now, and I've done all kinds of private investigations, from insurance fraud to all manner of highly personal cases. My Bigfoot encounter occurred during one of my investigations, when the last thing on my mind was actually encountering the hairy critter, whom until then I would have believed was as fictitious as Father Christmas or the Tooth Fairy. I now stand corrected, and I'm much more sober and open-minded in my judgments these days, as I'm forced to conclude that we do not know everything that is out there. This mysterious world of ours clutches many secrets like sparkling jewels tightly to her breast, and conceals them in our midst. Yet to the seekers out there she may share some of her jewels of revelation that come with a cost. For the wise discerning man that can see clearly is considered a fool by the man that is indeed blind. For the blind man arrogantly believes he knows it all, but the sighted man of wisdom has conceded that there is much still to know that he knows not. For the fool presumes he knows, but the wise man discerns and assumes not. I am from Seattle in Washington State, and have lived in this part of the world all my life, and I grew up in a leafy green suburb of Washington with my sister Andrea, who was a couple of years older than me at the time, and my mother and dad. Growing up, my mother was a hairdresser in downtown Seattle, and sometimes my sister and I would help her in her hair salon during the school holidays, sweeping up the hair off the floor and washing our customers' hair. I remember I loved hanging out in the hair salon because the stories people would share with my mother quite frankly boggled the mind, and being a nosy Parker by nature, I listened in on all these interesting snippets of conversation. For some reason people tend to let go of their inhibitions when they're being pampered, and they would spill out the beans about so many things that they would possibly never usually talk about so freely. I remember my ears would be flapping as I listened to people's stories, and sometimes they concerned people that I actually knew that lived in my neck of the woods, so those stories were particularly interesting to me. I learnt, for example, that Mrs. Murray at number 26 had had a ghostly encounter at her home and was so terrified that she'd actually called out a team of paranormal investigators. I learnt that Mrs. Elliot, who my mother knew personally as one of her clients, had actually been spotted in a coffee bar in Seattle, seemingly getting up close and personal, or rather too familiar and over-cosy with another man, who was clearly not her husband. Then there was the ever-so-annoying and belligerent Mr. Parker, the very disagreeable, cantankerous man that nobody on our street liked, who worked as a roofer and had recently put in a hefty claim at an insurance company based on his disability caused by a roofing accident, whereby he claimed he couldn't work anymore because he had severely damaged his back. Yet he had been spotted by his neighbour carrying heavy amounts of furniture into his house. So I ask you, how bad could his back really be? Growing up, I was put simply a nosy Parker who was always fascinated by other people and by human behaviour. Believe it or not, the human species is actually rather interesting to watch because we're all so curiously different. I remember my parents had brought me a pair of binoculars for bird watching the previous Christmas, and so I thought I'd observe the human species rather than the feathery kind. I decided to go and spy on Mr. Parker to see whether he was making false claims to the insurance company. I know it wasn't really significant to me, nor really any of my business at the time, but being naturally curious by nature, I could not wait to see if the claims made about him were actually true. So the very next afternoon I spent a couple of days watching the comings and goings of Mr. Parker. I had never liked the cranky, tumultuous man because he made no secret of the fact that he absolutely loathed children, and he seemed to hate and positively despise everybody else's dog, apart from his own, of course. His dog was a mischievous black Labrador called Mutt, who was always perfect in his partisan, very biased eyes, and despite his dog's appalling behaviour, it was everybody else's dogs that got reprimanded, except his, of course. He always frowned upon us as kids and regarded us as a lower form of pond life. I thought it would be good to get even with him, especially after he had the audacity to tell me that my Pekingese dog Crispin looked like a drowned rat with a flat nose, and really was quite an ugly-looking dog. "It beats me," he would say, "why you would keep such an ugly dog, and not something intelligent and more manly like my Labrador mutt." I would tell him that Crispin was a very attractive, intelligent dog, which was indeed true, and to stop being so rude and offensive to other people's animals. So on this particular day, as I watched his house curiously, I noticed a man sitting in the car on the opposite side of the road, using a very tiny pair of inconspicuous binoculars to watch Mr. Parker's coming and goings. I knew instinctively that he was a private investigator spying on Mr. Parker to see if he was conning the insurance company out of a sizable, large financial settlement. I watched Mr. Parker coming out of the front door of his house. He was bent over double, looking like a decrepit old man, wearing a paisley dressing gown and a pair of grey slip-on slippers. He was hobbling very precariously on his walking stick, as if every movement pained him. He put on an agonising, wincing expression on his face and patted his back awkwardly, as if he was in dreadful pain. For the less discerning, it appeared that the poor man was indeed physically compromised, because his clever performance was remarkably convincing. I noticed his steely hawk-like eyes were pinned on the cars parked on the opposite side of the road, as he furtively looked from left to right, glancing and checking to see if anyone was indeed spying on him. I realised that the private investigator parked on the street opposite had slipped down his seat so that he could not be observed. There were other empty cars parked there, so the private detective's car did not appear unnaturally suspicious, nor did it stand out. Mr. Parker physically relaxed when he thought no one had observed him, but he still hobbled awkwardly into the house, just to be sure no one was watching. Now, Mr. Parkinson, or Mr. Parker if you like, well, he had a black Labrador mix, as I told you, called Mutt, and on this occasion the excitable dog had slipped out of the front door and was tearing down the open front yard to the house on the opposite side of the street, where he liked to bark at Molly, the beautiful golden retriever who would be sitting behind the fence in her backyard, looking ever so regal in her long flowing golden coat. I always sensed that she had a rather high opinion of herself. For some unknown reason, those two dogs just love barking at each other, and this raucous behaviour invariably always incensed Mr. Parkinson, who suddenly in a moment of anger straightened out his hunched back and raced across the road. His black Labrador Mutt was barking jubilantly at Molly, who was reciprocating with much more higher-pitched series of barks. "Shut up, Molly," shouted Mr. Parker. "You're upsetting my dog," he shouted. It was so typical for him to blame somebody else's dog for bad behaviour, as it never even crossed his mind or even dawned upon him that his dog was indeed the instigator of the frenzied barking. I watched in absolute shock and horror as Mr. Parkinson bent over double to drag Mutt by the collar, where he maintained a stooped position for a long time, pulling Mutt across the road, back to his house as quickly as he could. In that moment his cover was well and truly blown, especially when Mutt was declining to get back into the house and simply sat on the lawn, refusing to budge. So Mr. Parker, in exasperation, picked up the disgruntled-looking Mutt into his arms and carried him with little difficulty back into the house, where he surreptitiously closed the front door behind him, glancing quickly across the street at the cars parked across the road, with a rather worried expression on his face. I could indeed discern the triumphant look of the private investigator's face as he clicked his camera and took several photographs, and then he drove away. It was in that moment that I definitely remember the seed was sown, and I began to feel very certain that I fancied becoming a private investigator one day. As a young boy, I would learn things about people that other people did not comprehend. I knew, for example, that the man everybody thought that Mrs. Elliot was having an affair with was in fact her twin brother, whom she hadn't seen for over 2 years at the time, and was exceptionally close to him. I also learnt that Mrs. Murray was sleeping in the cottage away from her main house because a ghostly apparition of a strange man kept standing at the end of her bed at night and it was freaking her out. I gather she believed it was the ghost of her father-in-law, who had hated and despised her in life, and she believed was extracting some kind of revenge in the hereafter. I learnt that she had moved into the cottage to avoid the nightly visitations from this menacing spectre. When I would tell my mother some of these things I knew, she would say in a nonchalant way, "You have the makings of a remarkable private detective." And those words were indeed like a fertiliser to the seed that was sown in my life. And that all led to me becoming a private investigator. And so it was shortly after I got married, I finally set up my own sleuthing business, or detective agency if you like. And although I made a series of foolish blunders along my journey, it was not long before I became pretty skilled at the job in hand, acquiring an uncanny knack of remaining hidden in plain sight and taking on all manner of various disguises whenever necessary. There were negative aspects to the job, of course, like working irregular hours and spending hours at a time in a car waiting for your suspect to leave the premises. But on the whole, watching people is very interesting, which is why all those reality television shows and social media, of course, have become so popular of late, as invariably people are quite fascinated with each other's lives. Yet I always do frequently warn my own kids never to get zealous of all the social media stuff that they observe, where you see people plastering happy faces and idyllic lavish photographs of their seemingly perfect holidays at fancy ski resorts in Aspen, or tea on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, or a cruise in the Caribbean. A lot of the stuff you invariably observe or see is not what it ever appears, and it would not surprise me at all, for example, if the girl in question is deeply depressed in her daily life, or drinks excessively, or is actually cleaning the toilets at the ski resort. Yet to an impressionable outside observer, looking at her photographs, it's easy to become intimidated with feelings of inadequacy. You might falsely believe, for example, that she was deliriously happy with a very enviable, opulent, lavish lifestyle. Maybe the highly airbrushed photographs would make him or her appear seemingly flawless, which is also a fabrication. This is the deceptive imagery she wants to project and convey to all her viewers in social media, but it's possibly not at all true. I see these misleading portrayals of people's lives over and over again, from celebrities to the girl next door, and as a private detective, in reality, nothing surprises me anymore, apart from the story I'm going to convey to you now that surprised the hell out of me. My sister, her husband, and both of her two sisters are part of my sleuthing team, so you could say it's a family business that I've been running now for over 20 years. And most of our investigations start with an inquiry on the telephone, which invariably leads to an appointment with the individual in question, where we decide whether we can offer our services to the client or not. My strange, rather curious story begins when an affluent, tall, dark, rather debonair, handsome man came into my offices one day. He was wearing a very smart Broke Brothers suit and a pair of very stylish leather brogues. He looked rather uncomfortable as he stood there, shifting awkwardly from one leg to another, and appearing as if the last place he wanted to be was in an investigator's office. I offered the man a seat, and he sat up so straight, looking even more on edge as when he was standing up, and he nervously ran his hands through his smooth hair. "What can I do for you?" I asked, looking at the man more closely. He was very clean-shaven, with a deep-set pair of earnest brown eyes and a rather boyish-looking face. He cleared his throat, looking rather uncomfortable for a moment. "I think my wife may be cheating on me," he said, blurting out the words so quickly as if he detested the very sound of them. "I see," I said. "May I ask you why you believe this to be the case?" "Well," he said, "she's not herself these days. She seems all distant and detached towards me." "Well, there can be all kinds of reasons that can happen," I assured him. "Then there's the fact that she never seems to answer her cell phone when I call her at any time of the day." "I see," I said. "Well, some people might not answer because they're busy. Or maybe she just doesn't feel in the mood. There could be all kinds of reasons." "No," said the man. "I know my wife, and she always used to answer the phone. I'm terrified I'm going to lose her. She's my world, and she's so stunningly beautiful." "Have you got a photograph of her?" I asked. The man was shaking as he opened the wallet, and handed me the photograph of his wife. The young woman smiling back at me in the picture looked like the girl next door, and not what I was expecting to see at all in the photograph, because she seemed like a decent, wholesome sort of girl who didn't appear to be the type to go cavorting around bars, picking up strange men. She was very modestly attired in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, and did not give me the impression of a high-maintenance sort of girl that spends extortionate amounts of money on lavish beauty treatments or designer clothes, nor did she look like the type eager to attract attention from interested men by languishing around the place like a peacock strutting her feathers. "Do you believe your wife is the type of person who would cheat on you?" I asked. "No. She's shy and she's quiet and unassuming," he said. "Look," I said to him, "I'm going to be very straight with you, and that is that nothing you have said gives me any cause to believe or even suggest remotely that your wife is cheating upon you. Nothing you have said to me is ringing any alarm bells in my head. There could be, of course, a very rational explanation why she doesn't answer your telephone calls. And as for being distant, maybe she's going through a challenging time lately. We are not all robots programmed to behave the same way all the time. We're humans, and things in life can sometimes drag us down or lift us up." "What are you saying to me," said the man, "that you're not willing to take my case because my wife does not dress provocatively enough and comes home smelling of men's aftershave? Is not my money of any value to you compared to the next man's?" "I am not saying that I won't investigate your case," I interceded, "but I just think you might consider being straight with your wife and asking her what indeed is the matter and why is she being so distant lately, because maybe you really need to communicate a lot better, that's all. There really could be a very rational reason why she's very disconnected recently. Look, I don't want to be suspicious, nor do I want to be the interrogating husband prying into my wife's affairs. I'm just asking you to follow her for a couple of days, that's all, so I know what she gets up to when my back is turned. I've no peace of mind worrying about what she's getting up to all day. It stresses me out a lot." "Oh, very well," I said. "I'll do it." The young gentleman thanked me and proceeded to give me all the details of his home that was situated in a wooded, very countrified area of Washington State, and he also gave me photographs of his wife, who was called Tansy. A few days later, I found myself driving to a very spectacular area of Washington State, where there were mountainous valleys, pretty meadows, and beautiful wooded areas. It was not long before I came across the pretty home where my client lived with his wife. They did indeed live in a beautiful Cape Cod-style home on the edge of a white gravel road that was situated directly opposite a wooded area that was accessible to both hikers and cyclists. The pretty pale blue house was symmetrical in appearance, with an attractive arched front entranceway, and it possessed double-hung windows with stylish shutters and a steep, dark roof with side gables and overhang and some gabled dormers. There was a long cobbled path that led to the white front door, and on either side of the door were very stylized pots filled with pretty flowering white plants. I imagine the entertainment area must have been around the rear end of the property. The front yard was extremely pretty, with a scattering of fruit trees along with the traditional evergreen firs so typically seen in Washington State. I parked my car behind a couple of crooked trees with twisted, gnarled roots that jutted out on the edge of the gravel road, so that if the wife came out of the property in her car, I would cautiously be able to follow her without being detected. On the first day of my investigation, the young woman was wearing jeans and a white blouse with her short-length brown hair tied back in a ponytail. I watched her parking her car very haphazardly in her parking spot. She climbed out of the car and darted across the road very hurriedly. I was aware that she kept looking at her cell phone to check out the time, which made me indeed wonder if she was meeting someone. I watched her scurry into a bookshop, and I noticed she was looking at books like The Power of Meditation, Learning to Love Yourself, and Advanced Yoga Techniques. She purchased all three of the books and raced towards a coffee shop very quickly, where she met up with a stranger older-looking lady with short-cropped silvery hair and very large eclectic-looking bright pink glasses. Tansy, my client's wife, ordered a round of iced coffees for them both, and after they were served by the sweet-looking waitress, I immediately moved to a table within hearing distance to eavesdrop in on the conversation. To my astonishment, the older woman sitting opposite Tansy reached into her large carrier bag and pulled out a bunch of tarot cards from the deck, which she began to shuffle them vigorously in her manicured hands with her long pink painted talons. I realised immediately that Tansy was having a tarot reading, and I observed that other people in the coffee shop were watching from a distance with curious, intrigued expressions written on their faces. "What do you want to know?" asked the woman. Tansy looked thoughtful for a moment. "I'm not sure. I just want to know what the cards are going to say about my life." "Well, this looks good," said the lady. "I see that you're on a spiritual search. The cards are showing me a longing and a ravenous hunger to find answers to everything in your life. And that is very good indeed, for we should all be searching." "That's right," said Tansy. "I'm trying to find myself, I think. I've felt lost for a very long time, wondering what on earth I was doing here and what my purpose could possibly be. This card here," she continued, "suggests that you struggle to articulate and communicate your thoughts and feelings, and you feel somewhat repressed emotionally." "Yes, I think that's right," reflected Tansy. "I've never been great at expressing my feelings. I'm actually rather reserved." "I see you're doing very fine in the love department. You seem to have won 2 hearts of very tall men that are clearly besotted about you." Tansy giggled. "My husband's tall, but I'm not aware of another admirer out there." "Oh, he is out there, believe me, and he's potty about you." My ears perked up as I listened to this conversation. Could Tansy know who this mystery admirer was? And was she in fact seeing him, as my client had suggested, behind his back, and acting all nonchalant about it? The following morning I was parked in my usual hiding spot, when to my amazement Tansy came straight out of her house, not in her car, but on her own, and in one arm she was carrying a yoga mat, and the other hand a portable water bottle. I noticed she was wearing pink workout leggings and a matching top, and she was heading straight towards the wooded area on the opposite side of the road from her house. Was she meeting someone, I wondered, or was she going to do some yoga in the woods? I immediately followed her from a distance along the hiking trail, making absolutely certain she remained oblivious to my presence. The woods were quite spectacular this spring morning, and the forest was full of interesting trees, from maples to ash and cottonwood, and the sound of the warbles and chirps of the pretty songbirds could be heard all across the valley. The paths had been superbly maintained by the Forestry Commission, I imagine, but I got the very distinct impression that this serene wooded area was not frequented regularly by many people, as it was a little off the beaten track and not so easily accessible, except to the locals in the immediate area. I could hear the sounds of water as I kept a safe distance behind Tansy. I then discovered that she was moving towards an exquisite-looking stream that meandered through the woods and made a calming, gushing sound so indicative of flowing water. I watched as Tansy placed down her yoga mat and sat down on the ground with her palms facing upwards on her crossed legs as she began to make those strange meditational sounds with her eyes tightly closed. In truth, I felt rather uncomfortable spying on Tansy like this, and was beginning to feel a bit like a peeping Tom, and that was not a feeling that rested well with me, I can tell you. I was just about to walk away when I realised to my amazement that I was not the only person spying on Tansy, and this alarmed me. Loitering in the shadows was a dark form that appeared to be peering through the bush at the young woman meditating on the mat. At first I observed the cone-shaped head, which was so high off the ground that I realised that whatever this thing was, he was easily over 7 foot tall. Suddenly, fortunately, I got a much better view of the creature, as with one long arm he pressed down a large piece of foliage, and I realised in astonishment that this creature, whom I imagine must have been male, was looking upon Tansy with a passionate adulation. It was clear that he had a huge crush on the young woman, and I realised he must have watched her doing meditation in the woods over a period of time and grown rather accustomed to her presence here, but he definitely liked her a lot. Yet it was very clear he remained rather elusive and quiet, and she had no idea that he was actually there. While the critter was hiding behind the foliage, I never observed more than his leathery grey skin, flat nose and prominent brow ridge. But his face appeared remarkably human-like, with deep-set animated gold eyes that looked intelligent and kind, and as crazy as this may sound, he looked like he was a rather congeniable, likeable sort of fellow, who was easygoing and relaxed, and never given to aggression or anger. I know it probably sounds crazy, but that is what I discerned from the creature's energy. And as a private investigator, I do tend to read people's energy remarkably well. I can usually tell within 2 minutes of a meeting whether someone is friendly, reticent, shifty, or even aggressive. I watched Tansy finish her meditation, do a couple of yoga stretches, and then finally roll up her mat, while she drank a sip of water from her bottle. And then she walked out of the forest, while the creature watched her leave. I remained hidden behind the tree where I'd been hiding, and I was relieved that the creature had not observed me, although I highly doubt he would have been aggressive towards me. If he had seen me, I suspect he would have possibly just glided away very quickly. As soon as Tansy had disappeared, the creature crouched down on all fours with his overlong arms and long powerful legs, and placed his flat nose on the ground, and was smelling intently the very place where Tansy had been. He seemed to savour the smell like someone enjoying the smell of sweet cinnamon buns, or the sweet summer smell of fresh roses. He then rolled his long, brawny, sinewy body on the ground, like a dog rolling in the grass, covering himself with dirt, as if he wanted to soak up the smell of Tansy's body. I knew by the jubilant expression on the creature's face that Tansy had a very big, hairy admirer, and then I remembered the tarot reading the previous day, and how Tansy had been informed that she had a secret admirer, who was no other than Bigfoot himself. I chuckled to myself at this startling revelation, for before today I hadn't even believed that Bigfoot was real. The creature was 7 foot and about 3 foot wide, with long lean legs and very muscular, brawny, sinewy body, and he was covered in long, flowing, shaggy, deep auburn hair, and he was very majestic and beautiful in a unique kind of way. But everyone has a different perception of beauty, but in my opinion, this creature was just that. Later that day, when I returned to the office, I called Tansy's husband to come and see me urgently. I will never forget how ghostly pale the poor man looked when he finally entered my offices. He was quite literally shaking in his boots, and when I offered him a chair, he declined to sit down. Out with it, he said, shifting on his legs awkwardly. "Is my wife having an affair?" "No, she's not," I said. The relief that flooded over the young man's face was like a person on death row being given a last-minute reprieve. The young man pulled out a chair and sat down. "Well, what did you find out?" "I found out that your wife is on a journey of discovery. She's on a search, trying to find out who she is." The young man looked puzzled. "My wife knows who she is," he said. "I'm not meaning literally," I said to him. "I'm meaning more spiritually. From what I observed, your wife is just soul-searching, which is why she may be rather introverted at the moment. She is possibly meditating on her thoughts. And as for answering her cell phone, spiritual people often don't, because they're concerning themselves with things beyond this world." "I see," said the man. "There is a way you could connect with her," I suggested. "Really?" he asked. "How?" "Why don't you buy her a book on meditation and discuss doing some of these practices together with an interest in common? You may find she will open up to you." "I will do that," said the man. "Thank you very much. There's just one more delicate issue that I have to discuss with you." "Go on," said the young man. "Your wife appears to have a secret admirer." "What?" said the man. "What the hell? Who is this dude? I'll kill him when I get hold of him." Let's just say when your wife was meditating in the woods, there was a hot-blooded male watching over her. So if I was you, I would advise her possibly not to meditate in the woods, just for precautionary reasons. I don't believe your wife is in any danger, because her admirer seems to be a very harmful, reticent sort of fellow. Needless to say, it's possibly not the wisest things to do is to meditate in the woods. You could create a cosy area in your yard for such an activity. I did happen to notice that you have a rather superb-looking yard. Would you believe it? A week later, the young man actually phoned me and told me that he had taken my advice and transformed his marriage, and he couldn't thank me enough. He told me that he and his wife were meditating together, and that they had turned the area in their yard into a calmful, restful retreat with a waterfall and a rock pool, and an exquisite wooden deck with swinging chairs and cosy mats, as well as an in-house bar. It sounds wonderful, I said. It's more than wonderful, he said. I have my wife back again, and it's all thanks to you. The very next day, the man sent me a box of the finest French champagne. So there you are. That's my story. Well, wow, that was a fantastic story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.